State Board of Education meeting to order on April 28th, 2014. I'm Glenda Ritz, Superintendent of Public Instruction. If we could have the roll call, please.
Mr. Albert?
Present.
Mr. Elsner? Dr. Freitas?
Present.
Mr. Hendry?
Yes.
Ms. Neal? Present. Mrs. O'Brien?
Present.
Dr. Oliver?
Present.
Mr. Walker?
I know he's
Tony's
here.
here.
I think he went to the restroom. I
heard
think.
present from
Mr. Watts?
Present.
Mrs. Wicker?
Present.
Superintendent Ritz?
Present. If we would all stand for the pledge of allegiance, please. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. We have the approval of the agenda. There is an action item that needs to be added. We neglected to send you the third resolution from the roundtable, and so we've included that for you. And so it takes at least 3 people to add that to the agenda. Do I have at least 3? All right. So we will add that to the agenda today. Are there any more? And so we have no minutes to approve today, I don't believe. No, we'll do that at our next board meeting. I have no statement from the chair at this time. Do we have any board member comments or reports? Seeing none. We're going to take public comment first, and we'll see if we have public comment to be delivered to me. Thank you. As indicated in the agenda that we published, each person will have 3 minutes to address the board. Our first speaker is Kelly Fahler. And that's 3 minutes total for your comments, I believe. Thank you, Kelly.
Good morning, and thank you for allowing me to speak today. I would like to make the board aware of a few numbers from our 2012 graduation rates and how these relate to standards. First of all, the IDOE has a graduation rate goal of 90%, okay? The graduation rate for students who can pay full price for lunch, 94.9%. If you can pay for lunch, that's 94.9%. If you cannot afford to pay full price for lunch, that rate drops to 85.9%. These are 2012 rates. The graduation rate of Hispanic students, 83.7%. Remember, we're shooting for a goal of 90. English language learners, 81.2%. The special education graduation rate, 72.7%. 72. Now, how are these numbers going to trend? I looked at that also, and I got all this information from the Department of Education website, most specifically the Compass website. If we follow the trends of how our student body will change over the coming years, from 2013 to 2022, the paid meal graduation rate, 51.8% of our students could pay for meals in 2013. That number is going to drop to 31.8% by 2022. The Hispanic rate, that population is growing. They were at 9.6% in 2013, and they're going to jump to 14.6% in 2022, and that is about that is about the rate of our kindergarten class right now. English language learners, they're going to go from 5% to 7.3%. And I bring these numbers to your attention because they are significant. Because as these new standards that you're voting on today will become enacted, none of these populations are specifically and appropriately addressed by these populations. We will have a growing Hispanic population, a growing population of English language learners, and a growing population of students who cannot afford to pay for school lunch. The special education student body, they're a large student body, and their numbers are not expected to change drastically. And none of these students are addressed specifically and appropriately by the new standards that we're voting on today. I just want you to bear those numbers in mind. And a few more figures I'd like you to think about are our college remediation rates. If that's okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Jackie Roten.
Good morning. I've been in front of this board many times before. I sent an email to everyone last night. I don't know if anybody actually read it, but I went to every evaluation. I went to the roundtable meeting. I went to every public hearing. I was the only one from the public who went every day, and I know that for a fact because I was the only one there on Valentine's Day. And I saw what happened. I know the hours that were put into this. I know the money that was spent to put into this for not only the people doing the evaluations, but the hotel rooms that we had to pay for, everything like that. I appreciate them trying to do something and trying to help, but it's not like it was out of the goodness of their heart. They all got paid for it. I didn't. I was there for my family. And what came out in the final product was shameful. And I watched as two sets were made, two sets of standards, and only one released to the public. And the other set the English department called it the EGs, and the math area called it teacher assistants or something like that. I watched it happen. I heard all the little comments when people would think that nobody was there, nobody was listening, because they would forget I was there. How it's not a problem with the math, it's a problem with the parents being stupid. And if you like, I can give you the names of the people who said it. Another individual sat there and said, why are we wasting our time on this? All we need to do is to get the assessments done. Then I can create my curriculum. Which I thought the whole reason why we did it this way was so that didn't happen. Another individual sat there on a little 15-minute break and said, I'm not sure why I'm here. My major was in etymology. And this is the math department? Another person said, yeah, I work at Eli Lilly in chemistry. I don't know why they put me on here for math. It was just, I don't know why. And I don't know why people are not paying attention to the experts in their testimony. If we paid them to give their opinions, why are we not listening to them? It's very disconcerting and very disheartening to me to watch this whole process and have this final product that we have now. Thank you.
Thank you. Don Bowman.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, for the opportunity to speak to you today and also the honorable board members. I came here today for two reasons. Well, maybe more than two. My two grandchildren, one is 9 and one is 5. And my dedicated wife of 32 years, Sierra, that taught as an educator for 32 years. Myself, an aviator for a little more than 50. At that time, I had the pleasure to go in many, many countries and see a lot of things. Our forefathers brought to this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. We are now engaged on a great battlefield, testing whether this nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. Those words are just as true today as they was the day they were spoken. They are the greatest words that's ever spoken. We have to listen to that and see that, hear that, fight for that every day. Thank you. God bless you. God bless this nation. Thank you.
Thank you. Lim Dixon?
Leon. I'm only getting 3 minutes here. I'm going to pass on the salutations. The standards that you're looking at today are evidently from Bedford, Indiana. And the expert there was a guy named Coleman. Those of you in the world of education will be familiar with the Coleman report. Okay. You're not familiar with the idea that the Coleman report and Coleman were very anti-family. That was his intent, and that is part of the DNA of what you're doing here today. In 3 minutes, I can't really condense that opinion for you, but you've all got my email. It's on the little thing there. If you email me, I will set you straight on that. If you have any doubts, you ought not have doubts. I've been in this thing for a long time. On the math standards, I'm thinking that the Indiana did pretty well in TIMS in the 8th grade. That was recorded in the Star. But I think on the overall thing, my friend Mike Pence is making a blunder here. And in part, you seem to be hell-bent to do the same thing. What to do? I'm looking around here. I see nobody in this room that has been a friend of Mike Pence longer than I have. We go back to his first runs for Congress, and we lost both times. But he's still a friend. So what to do? You don't come in here and just attack people and denigrate standards or anything like that. The critic always has an obligation to propose something. And so I'm going to make a proposition or two, and then I'm going to sit down. I would recommend to you that you recommend to the round table their usual practice of cut rate cut scores. If you don't understand that, you've got my email. A second concordant report, you should ask for them. They set their I-STEP cut scores at their usual levels, and then ask them to set them at the Common Core rigor levels. You understand what I'm saying? You'd be like New York State, if anybody's paying attention. In other words, absolve yourselves of misinforming those 10,000 kids a year and all the others whose defective degrees are ignored and let loose down the memory hole. I have not been impressed with the process, by the way, in case anybody wanted to know.
Thank you. Next speaker is Tim McRoberts.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Name's Tim McRoberts. I'm the principal at Speedway High School, and I'm here this morning representing two groups of people. Number one, I've had the pleasure this year of serving as the president of the Indiana Association of School Principals. Dr. Todd Best, I know you're all familiar with, could not be here this morning. And on behalf of the principals of Indiana, I'd just like to say we are in favor of the passage of these standards, both math and English language arts today. I've had the pleasure of traveling around the state this year, all the way from Plymouth to Hauptstadt. I had no idea where Hauptstadt was before this year. The principals and the administrators in the state of Indiana are ready to move forward. In the last few years, there have been a lot of changes in education. Educators have always stepped up. They've moved forward. They're ready to go. And I would like to echo that again this morning on behalf of the administrators. The other group of people I represent today are the 31 teachers in my building at Speedway High School. And we've been preparing and we've been working toward this for a few years now. And we're ready to move forward. The teachers are ready to move forward and change the conversation to assessments, to professional development, to the cut scores that are going to be very important to put into place. So I guess on closing, on behalf of the educators in Indiana, we're ready to step up again when called to do so. Thank you.
Thank you. Sue Lyle.
Thank you, and excuse my gravelly voice. When Indiana decided to adopt or abandon the Common Core, many Hoosiers were very excited. We had the opportunity to be a pioneer, to craft world-class standards that other states might duplicate. We were especially excited when two experts, Sandra Stotsky and James Milgram, decided to advise us. As you are no doubt aware, Professor Stotsky is credited with developing in Massachusetts some of the nation's strongest academic standards for K-12 students. After those took effect, Massachusetts SAT scores rose for 13 consecutive years, and that state continues to lead the nation in math and reading proficiency. In 1999, when Indiana was rewriting our own language arts standards, Professor Stotsky served as our consultant. Thanks to her, we ended up with nationally regarded standards that received an A from Fordham Institute and have been deemed superior to the Common Core. James Milgram is a native of South Bend and professor of mathematics emeritus at Stanford University. He is internationally acclaimed for his expertise in algebraic and geometric topology. With other mathematicians, he revised the California Mathematics Standards, which became known as the highest in the country. Professors Milgram and Stotsky have something else notable in common. They both were members of the Common Core's validation committee, but they both refused to sign off on the academic quality of those national standards. Unfortunately, they have something else in common as well. Both tried to advise Indiana in writing new standards and were ignored by Department and Board of Education staff members. Early in the process, Professor Stotsky warned Indiana that ELA drafts 1 and 2 were virtually the same as Common Core, and she urged the state to start over. Professor Milgram performed a formal evaluation of draft 2, documented numerous errors, sent a thorough review to the state, only to find out that most of the corrections he recommended were not made. We want to set the record straight about Professors Stotsky and Milgram and their efforts to help Indiana write good standards. They are, in fact, educational reform heroes who alerted the nation about the dangers of the Common Core. They blew the whistle on the fact that the Common Core state standards were not internationally benchmarked and would weaken how U.S. students fare against peers around the world. Indiana had the chance to draw on their expertise and draft the highest academic standards in the nation, as Senate Bill 91 requires. We would have been the envy of other states that are now trying to escape the Common Core. Instead, we ignored what they said. The fact that there have been no negative comments from proponents of Common Core on our new draft standards should speak volumes, because the new standards are not judged to be internationally benchmarked by those qualified to make that determination. I urge you to reject those standards. If you don't, we will be sorry, and our children are the ones that will pay the price.
Thank you. Suzanne Shurdy.
Good morning, and thank you for giving me a few moments to share my concerns. The law governing Indiana's rewrite of our K-12 education standards required that the standards do a number of things, including meet national and international benchmarks for college and career readiness, and use the highest standards in the United States. I submit to you that the process employed has failed to meet those requirements. First, no proof has been offered that the proposed standards are either internationally or nationally benchmarked. It's clear from commentary and opinion on all sides of the debate that the proposed Indiana standards draw heavily on Common Core. The fact that the proposed draft appears to be a cut and paste job raises serious concerns with regards to benchmarking and college readiness. You may recall that we were told by one of the original writers of Common Core, Jason Zimba, that the Common Core expectation is to prepare students for non-selective colleges. In fact, he said at the time, "I think it's a fair critique that it is a minimal definition of college readiness." The fact that Common Core standards were not internationally benchmarked was chief among the concerns of national mathematics expert James Milgram, who said that Common Core math standards leave expectations for U.S. students 2 years behind their international counterparts. Non-selective two-year college is a low bar. It's sad to see Indiana follow the federal lead in misleading parents into thinking that following Common Core will make their child ready for college, and many parents are concerned that that has not been addressed by this current draft. A higher bar should be set for Hoosier students. Second, it's difficult for the citizens of Indiana to understand why a process which promised to use as its basis the highest standards in the U.S. drew so heavily from Common Core, while ignoring the highly regarded standards of Massachusetts and California and even Indiana's previous standards, all of which were evaluated by the Fordham Foundation as being more rigorous and more clearly written than Common Core. Third, as you know, draft number 2 was widely criticized by parents, Indiana educators, and experts alike. It was called an incoherent jumble, and that was one of the kinder reviews. We've been told that draft number 3 is substantially different, and yet no provision has been made for a review of it. Instead, it seems the much vaunted process has ended in a whirlwind rush to final approval here today. No side-by-side comparisons have been offered, and experts are saying it's actually a degraded version of Common Core with a shiny new Hoosier label. Frankly, it is outrageous to me as a parent that no consideration has been given to a solid review of the final draft. It seems an attitude of let's get this done so we can move on prevails, and I don't think that's fair to parents and students in this state. I am not comfortable with this as a parent, and you shouldn't be comfortable with it as board members either. You represent the final opportunity to inject some sanity into this rodeo, and I hope you will take that responsibility very seriously today and reject this draft. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Stephanie Engelman. Stephanie Engelman.
Good morning, and thank you for your time. A year ago, Indiana made a great decision. We chose to create standards made for Hoosiers by Hoosiers. We saw, as a result of an outcry from the citizens of this great state, that Indiana deserved better than what the federal government was providing to us. It was a long process, and a great decision was made. You'll notice that I still wear my Say No to Common Core button, and that's because we still have Common Core in Indiana, and we will continue to have Common Core if we adopt the standards that are before you today. You have the power to be more than just a rubber stamp on last week's decision. You have the power to make a change and a real difference in the state of Indiana. The solution is already at your fingertips. As previous speakers have said, we had superior standards. Even the Fordham Institute, who is a pro-Common Core institute, said that Indiana's prior standards were superior to the Common Core. So we've spent this year and we've come out with a sloppy rewrite of Common Core, but you guys can say no today, and you can say, you know what, let's go back to where we were because it was better. Let's go back to our previous standards and take our time to develop standards that are truly superior, that are internationally benchmarked. The United States is falling behind in education, and that's a travesty. We are the best country in the world. Why are we not ranked #1 in education? And why don't we as Hoosiers lead that charge? Why don't we take this opportunity to bring back our old standards, and instead of a rush job to create new standards in a year because that's what we had to do, let's say, you know what, we've got good standards for now, and now we can sit back, we can start from the ground up and build the best standards this nation has ever seen. We can look at the countries that are ranked #1 in the world, and we can look at what they're doing, and we can call our educators to do that for our children and to provide that sort of an education for our children, because I know that's what our educators want to do, but we need to give them the tools and the foundation to be able to do that. And so I call on you, please, today, let your voice be heard. Let the voices of the citizens of this great state be heard. Our students deserve the very best, and I know that we can provide that to them. And our teachers deserve the very best. And I know that we, with your help, can provide that to them. But we have to start by saying no today, no to these standards, yes for our students, and yes for our educators. Thank you.
Thank you. Heather Crossan. Heather Crossan.
Thank you. I'd like to say, as somebody who was concerned over 2.5 years about the quality of the Common Core standards as a result of what came home in my student's backpack, I am deeply troubled and disappointed that by all estimations, Hoosier citizens and parents are going to see the same work come home. And as somebody who did have faith in the process, I'm here to tell you I've lost faith. Because what is being described as the most transparent process, the most thorough process ever, appears to be nothing more than, I hate to use the word, but a sham. It began, as you know, with passing the Common Core Pause Bill, and Senate Bill 91 followed later this year. However, from my perspective, a transparent process would not deny Hoosier citizens access to anything beyond Draft 1. Now, I know you could go to the meetings, which I did, and some of the standards were placed on the wall, on the overhead, but unless you have a photographic memory, those standards, anything beyond Draft 2, was not available to Hoosier educators not lucky enough to live in the Indianapolis area and be able to attend those meetings. And you could not contemplate them in any meaningful way. Secondly, I was shocked when Indiana commissioned national evaluators to do reports, which you all were available to those within the department by March 21st, and even sitting board members were denied access to those reports. Number 3, I'm deeply troubled by the speed and rush, the unprecedented nature with which this has been carried out. Having simply a few business days before the first vote by the roundtable is unprecedented. Likewise, the amount of time allowed for public comment was 4 times shorter than it was back in 2009. And again, the public was allowed to comment and see interim drafts in 2009. Taking public comment on what was later called raw ingredients is tantamount to not taking any public comment at all. And I think by everybody's standards, we know why. There was an end result in place from the very beginning, and this process was designed to deliver that end result, which is rebranding Common Core. And that's exactly what we have after all this time and money has been spent. And it was actually predicted a couple days after Senate Bill 91 passed out of the Senate Education Committee. An email floated around by Shauna Finlay. It actually wasn't by Dr. Shauna Finlay, but it quoted her. They said, on July 1st, we will adopt new standards. Now here's the kicker. These standards will look almost identical to Common Core state standards. We'll take the Common Core state standards and add a few that outline more detail and adopt them as Indiana standards. What the article did not say is we have to adopt college and career readiness standards to stay in compliance with our No Child Left Behind waiver. And when all is said and done, the standards will completely reflect the Common Core standards. It went on to say, so if teachers ask, don't stop your work on Common Core, they're just getting a new name. I understand from Dr. Shauna Finlay, who I spoke in length with, that the draft standards are coming out in late February. Once they do, you can compare them to the Common Core, and you will see that they are practically or even exactly the same. Thanks.
Thank you.
That was from an Indiana educator, and I think the die was cast long ago, and I think it's a real lost opportunity.
Thank you. Sierra Bowman. Sierra Bowman.
Good morning, and I want to thank you for the opportunity to speak. I wanted to express my concerns. I'm concerned when I compare the Common Core standards to the new standards, college and career ready. I'm concerned at the similarities. I expected there to be some similarities. I didn't expect it to be like 80% similarities. In the original Common Core, we could have 15% additional Indiana standards, or any state could have 15%, and it could still qualify for the Common Core, and it seems like that's what we've done. I'm concerned with the name College and Career Ready. That gives me a bit of concern because that term came with Common Core. It's a Common Core term, and now it's the name of our new standards. The similarity there concerns me as a parent, as a former educator, as a citizen of the United States. I'm concerned when I look at the textbooks that are Common Core. I'm concerned that our standards are so similar that those very textbooks can still be used because of the similarities. I'm concerned that those textbooks, I know in one of the textbooks, a 6th grade exercise in literature was to take the Bill of Rights. They couldn't change the first Bill of Rights, the freedom of speech, but the exercise, writing exercise, was to change 2 other Bill of Rights, suggesting that there's something wrong with the Bill of Rights for our children. An 11th grade exercise in the Common Core textbook. 11th graders were to be on a panel of 10 other panel members, and their job was to debate the validity and select who would qualify for dialysis and who would not qualify for dialysis. Well, I felt like that's almost like an exercise in practicing to be on death panels. Those kinds of exercises in English literature, no less, give me a great deal of concern. So as a citizen, I've been trying to participate in this process. I have attended the legislative review. I've come to the Board of Education meetings, trying to learn about this process. But as a parent, as a grandparent, as a citizen, I'm concerned with these standards that you have now the ability to accept or to vote no on. Thank you.
Thank you. Ann Harvey. Ann Harvey.
Good morning. I'm not an educator, but I've heard some wonderful statements by educators today against Common Core. But what brought me to this podium is yesterday on Chris Wallace on Fox News hailed Indiana as the first state to opt out of Common Core. And for a minute, I was really proud that, as one of our speakers said, Indiana could be a leader. But then I realized that no, the standards put before you today are no different than Common Core. So are we going to be a leader, or are we going to follow the steps? And that's really a concern for me, because I have children, I have great-grandchildren, grandchildren. I don't want them to be subject to Common Core. And the other thing is, I've heard over and over, oh, we can't change now because the cost of the textbooks. Well, a lot of money has been wasted through the years in Indiana. And if we do have to replace some textbooks, I think the taxpayers would be all for it, just to get a good set of standards in our schools. And please, let's give our kids and your kids a good education.
Thank you. Michelle McCarthy. Michelle McCarthy.
My name is Michelle McCarthy. I have a master's degree in higher ed administration. I'm also an adjunct faculty member at Ivy Tech, where I teach a Foundations of Student Success course. And I'm also a tutor for middle and high school students at Park Tutor School. I'm also the parent of 4 school-aged kids. Senate Bill 91 was a strong statement that Indiana was moving forward and away from Common Core. It was passed not only to nullify and void Common Core, but to move beyond it. Because as Governor Pence promised, Indiana's standards will be uncommonly high. We were asked to trust the process, but it seems the process has failed the children of Indiana if you allow for this rebranding of Common Core. It completely goes against the spirit of Senate Bill 91, and that is beyond disappointing to the citizens of Indiana. Where is the adequate evidence that the standards have met the requirements of the law that propagated them? Where was the formal expert analysis or public commenting by teachers on the final draft, which is substantially different from the one that was publicly released? How can due diligence even be possible in 6 days? Where are the international benchmarks? It is unprecedented for the state of Indiana to vote on standards without independent examination available for inspection. If these new standards are adopted, not only will Hoosier parents know that Common Core concepts have been accepted, but the rest of the nation will be aware of it too. As Dr. James Milgram's open letter to Hoosiers says, these standards provide the rest of the country with a dramatic example of what not to do. Please do right by the kids of Indiana and go back to using the 2006 standards that were actually uncommonly high and unique to the state of Indiana. Dr. Sandra Stosky, author of the Massachusetts ELA standards, says that draft number 3 is far worse than Indiana's own 2006 standards. Therefore, how will it be possible that these standards are going to be among the best in the nation? I implore you to go back and submit Indiana's 2006 math and ELA standards to be certified as career and college ready to maintain the NCLB flexibility waiver. Hoosier children deserve more, not less. I teach my college students about the power of choice and how the decisions they make today will directly affect their outcomes of tomorrow. Please make the right choice today. Thank you.
Thank you. Wesley Myerson. Wesley Myronson.
A couple of moments ago, I was tempted to come up here and say ditto and sit down. There are several things that concern me about your academic standards. Previous speakers have spoken well as to what those things are. One of the things that bothers me is Governor Pence touted loud and clear, this was created by Hoosiers for Hoosiers. Not so. Suji Shin of West Ed, she was one of the 4 lead people in writing the standards in California, and she was used for these standards that you're considering today. West Ed was funded by the Gates Foundation for the implementation of Common Core. And here we stand today saying that we don't have Common Core anymore. Yes, we have Common Core, we just call it something different. The old cliche is if it looks like a duck, walks like a duck, and quacks like a duck, it's a duck. We have a monstrosity. Might even call it an elephant. It's hard to describe an elephant, but I'm sure that every one of us, if we see an elephant, we know what an elephant is. And we know that this academic standards that you're considering is indeed Common Core. Call it whatever you want, it's still Common Core, and it's not right for the people of Indiana. One of the previous speakers posed the question, America being the greatest country in the world, why do we fail, or why do we fall short on being the greatest in education? I would like to pose an answer to that. It's because of the involvement of Washington. Our great President Reagan once said, Washington cannot solve our problems. Washington is our problems. So I implore you, do not adopt these academic standards that have been presented to you. Thank you.
Thank you. David Lance. David Lance.
Good morning. My name's David Lance. I have a master's in public affairs. I've worked with Dan Elsner to promote school choice, and when I worked with a group called Commit. I now have a company called Generation Self-Employed. We create entrepreneurship curriculum for an online downloadable service. I'm one of over 1,000 members of the homeschool vendors on LinkedIn. What you need to know, that if you have less than $2,000 and the requisite skills and understanding, you can create curriculum. Bill Gates didn't like Netscape back in the 90s, and that's why the courts labeled him a monopolist. What he's doing now is he's using his monopoly power to put little guys like me out of business. I teach economics, and one of the schools that I teach for is Ivy Tech. This is the econ textbook for Econ 101. The curriculum standards for economics at the high school level, E.4.6 says, explain how cost of government policies may exceed benefits because social or political goals rather than economic efficiency are being pursued. In other words, why does economic intervention create economic failure? Well, on page 196 of Brad Schiller's Essentials of Economics, 9th edition, which is the textbook used by Ivy Tech in Econ 101 across the state, I would like to quote about vested interests. Vested interests often try to steer the search away from the social optimum. They may try to sway public opinion with public interest advertising. They may use their wealth to finance the campaigns of sympathetic politicians. These are just a couple of reasons why government intervention won't always improve market outcomes. However, government intervention might worsen rather than improve market outcomes. Now, the gentleman just a moment ago talked about Susie Shin. What he didn't say was that the Gates Foundation last year gave West Ed, the organization she works for, nearly $400,000 in grants. On the board of directors for West Ed is Gavin Payne, the Director for Policy and Advocacy U.S. Programs for the Gates Foundation. Pearson Education also is a funder of West Ed. Also, Gates Foundation gave $1.38 million to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce explicitly so they could work with member chambers to advocate using TV ads, just as I read to you from the econ textbook. Additionally, they gave money to Stand for the Children, $4.5 million, which had 11 offices in different states, including Indiana, to run advertisements. One last thing you may not know is that Indiana Core Assessments for Education Licensing Program is already out there. The teachers that are graduating must pass this test created by Pearson. So here's my question. You know, that education expert, Rex Early, was quoted as saying, follow the money, because this dog don't hunt. You can use Indiana standards, and I've got a blog post, just go Google it. Thanks.
Thank you. J.D. Minier. J.D. Minier.
Well, greetings. It's a pleasure to be here addressing this august body. Background for me is I'm a federal candidate and for the U.S. House of Representatives in Indiana's 7th District. And for the last 2 years, my wife and I have traveled extensively because I'm a conservative. Prior to running for Congress, I was the president of one of the nation's oldest and largest GOP volunteer organizations called the Republican Assemblies. I headed up the state chapter, and as we traveled these last 2 years, we've gotten very high marks, a lot of kudos from the press about the work of Indiana in supporting vouchers, supporting school choice, and I want to give you kudos. What we have found, though, during this process of these last 3 drafts, and I want to point out, I'm also been a radio co-host for a couple years, so I've had Dr. Stotsky on my show. I've had a number of the conservative evaluators, people brought in here to look at these drafts, and they're very concerned. They're very concerned. As a federal candidate, I would like to go to Washington and help you out. I would like to work with Senator Grassley from Iowa and Congressman King from Iowa. They want to totally defund the Department of Education and the monies that are tied to the race to the top. You guys would not have to worry about that if we get our way. We hope to see that happen here in 2014. But there's something I want to leave you with this question. The term used quite a bit up in Washington has been a smidgen. There's a smidgen going on here. Now, that's an evaluation. And with the spirit of all the guests, I'm one of the last speakers, I believe, here today. The spirit of Senate Bill 91, the hard work of Hoosiers Against Common Core, with so many people represented here, so many people represented just 7 days ago, I asked this question of you. Is there a smidgen of Common Core in these drafts? That's my question, and I lay my case to rest, and I thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to speak, and God bless.
Thank you. Aaron Tuttle. Aaron Tuttle.
Hi, thank you. Today, I would just like to argue that the new standards should not be adopted because I don't feel that they have met the expectations for the new standards as set forth by Senate Bill 91. I only have time to touch on the one that I think is most important due to the importance for our children to be able to compete globally and nationally. That is that Senate Bill 91 required, as has been mentioned earlier, that they should meet national and international benchmarking. At the roundtable meeting last week, it was reported that the new standards had met international and national benchmarks for college and career ready standards. But unlike the adoption process of the 2009 math standards, no independent international benchmarking study was actually provided to validate that. Instead, the roundtable was told that because the sets of standards from which they pulled the new standards, which was the NCTM standards, Common Core, and Indiana's former standards, because they were internationally and nationally benchmarked, any compilation of standards used from them would create a set of internationally benchmarked standards. However, this was never verified with any analysis of the final draft. And I think there are 2 flaws in that type of reasoning. To begin with, there is really no proof that NCTM math standards or the Common Core standards are internationally benchmarked in themselves. Only the Indiana standards have a study proving that is actually the case. Additionally, sets of standards are just that. They're a set. And the standards work together as a whole, not independently as single standards to be internationally benchmarked. So cutting and pasting single standards from different benchmark set of standards doesn't necessarily end in a result of internationally benchmarked standards. Okay, so without really finalizing or without analyzing the final set of standards, I don't think that that claim can be made, and therefore I don't think that it meets the requirement of being internationally or nationally benchmarked. And as far as national benchmarking of college and career ready standards, the Common Core is really the only thing that meets that. And Professor Wu, who was a writer of the math standards, has said they are inferior to the Common Core math standards. I mean, I think if someone has been in the room writing the Common Core standards, their familiarity is pretty strong. And if they're saying it's not meeting that, they have not met that national benchmark. And for that reason, I think that they should not be adopted. I think, you know, our former standards were the best. The Common Core is probably better than some of the other states. And the new standards are at best fair. Why would Indiana move from best to fair? It's a step backwards. St. Jerome, who is the patron saint of scholars and school children, is famously quoted as saying, Good, better, best, never let it rest, till your good is better and your better is best. That is what the parents of Indiana want, and I think that's what you want as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Diane Finney. Diane Finney.
I have a master's degree in education, and I've been a substitute teacher for several years, but I come to you today not as an educator, but for the students of Indiana, 8 of which are my grandchildren, and which make me very concerned. I have been studying education issues for many, many years now, following all the bills that have come down from 1956 up to the present day, and I've seen the dumbing down of education. When the Indiana standards came out a few years ago, I was very pleased, and especially when I heard that other states and that across the nation that Indiana standards were built as the highest. So then when we went to Common Core and I saw all the dumbed down standards once again, I was very disappointed, and then elated when Indiana turned them down, and then deflated again when I realized that we have accepted the same standards. And they definitely are a quote, and I have here from the Indiana Standard, and I want to read this one for 2 reasons, to show that it's a direct quote from Common Core, and also it's not understandability. By the end of grade 7, students interact with tests proficiently and independently at the middle of the range and with scaffolding as needed for text at the high end of the range. And what does that mean? I have a master's degree, remember. I do not understand that. So I can only imagine what others who have not. And parents are not able to help and to work with their kids when they can't understand what is going on. The same is true of the math standards. And the loss of students and or parents and the kids being able to react together in doing their homework has been lost. Also, one of my main concerns that was in the area of the literature, the loss of our stories, the loss of the literature compared to informational text, which one example was about Obamacare in the Common Core standards. That does not belong in a literature classroom. I'm also, the term has been used, college and career ready. Does anybody attribute that students might be part of the reason why they're not college and career ready and not the standards themselves? Keep the old standards that are good and help to support Indiana students. Thank you.
Thank you. Cheryl Ferguson. Cheryl Ferguson.
Well, I'm very impressed with the caliber of speakers so far. I hope I can be somewhat legible. My name is Cheryl Ferguson. I am a native Hoosier. I've lived in Indiana my entire life. I have 2 daughters who are 6 years apart, and I can see a big difference between the education of my older daughter and my younger daughter, and that's how I got interested in what's going on with the standards. I'm also a pediatrician. I work in Fishers. I am a trained child advocate as a pediatrician. I am obligated by law to report neglect and abuse. While I have no doubt that those who wrote the standards had any intention of actually harming anyone, they are written without consideration for what is developmentally appropriate for children. There was a letter written by 500 early childhood developmental experts that was completely ignored by the Common Core people that wrote the Common Core standards. Would it be considered abusive to demand that all toddlers walk at 10 months? Yes, because it's normal to walk between 9 and 18 months. It's normal to read between 5 and 7 years. You can't expect all kindergartners to read at the end of kindergarten and tell them that they're stupid if they can't. The standards expect all kindergartens to read, maintaining an age-appropriate pace. The standards in kindergarten are far too numerous to expect a teacher to teach or a child of 5 or 6 to learn. Long hours of didactic learning will crowd out the need for young children to learn to play. And more research has been done. Play is an important part of childhood. I've seen an increase in referrals in my office for young 5 and 6-year-olds coming in, and the teacher says they have ADD and they need medicine. Do I think they really have ADD? No, I think they are expected to sit still for a developmentally inappropriate length of time. They're bored. They can't sit still that long. They get fidgety. The implications of removing playtime from kindergarten is yet to be seen. The Common Core standards have never been implemented anywhere before it has been forced upon the entire United States. There are still plenty of developmentally inappropriate standards in the new Indiana standards. What happens to children who are neglected before the age of 3 when they have no memory of that neglect? Mostly it is manifested as anger in their later childhood years. So what can we expect of these children who are expected to behave beyond their abilities and reprimanded for not being capable of that? What happens to children who are deprived of playtime? This is a type of neglect or even abuse. I shudder to think what will happen with an entire generation of kindergartners that grew up with the feeling that no one understood them or cared. I also have many more kids with anxiety. My point is these standards are experimental. How do we know they will work? But worse, how do we know that they will not cause grave harm?
Thank you. Mary Curtis. Mary Curtis.
Good morning. Thank you very much. I am Mary Jean Curtis. I'm from Carmel, and I'm not an expert in education. I won't pretend to be, but I am a grandmother of 4, and I hopefully speak from common sense, the school of common sense, which many have here this morning, and I couldn't possibly hold a candle to what they've said. But this guy right here, that's my grandson Cooper, just started school this year in a private Catholic school. And it wasn't long until he started coming home with materials all marked Common Core state standards. Like, wow, what? And then the more we found out, the more involved we got, and we didn't like what we were seeing, just practically speaking. His parents are graduates of Rose-Hulman, both engineers, both math whizzes. I don't hold a candle to them, and they're saying something's really wrong here. So I've really listened to experts from all across the field, people that I admire, people that are here today, and I have confidence that they're not good. And I think, as the one gentleman said, it's definitely a duck. Don't try to convince us that these aren't the Common Core, because they are. And I think the problem started last August with the stroke of the governor's pen when he created the CECI, the Center for Education, and what is it? The Center for Education and Career Innovation. You people right here are the closest that we've been to this process, especially you, ma'am. We elected you. You're the only thing that stands between us and what's happening here. And I feel like the CECI has come between us. I really do. I think that we've been taken out of the process. I think that's why you sense this great frustration here, because I'm just trying to figure out what is happening here. Why is this so out of control? Why are we not being listened to? And I feel like that the governor has determined that he needs this other panel that's thwarting your responsibility. Now, in fairness, in February, you delegated that responsibility to rewrite the standards to the CECI, if I'm correct. And that's what they're asking you to do today, rubber stamp what they've done. And I'm asking you, please, please, step back. Don't feel rushed. This is a big mistake. And I think yesterday really pinpointed my biggest fear is what this can lead to. In the Star, talking about the great big data fears that we have and this wonderful system. And here's the quote that the governor says, the big payoff would be forecasting the job market and using that information to adjust the education system to deliver workers to meet the needs of the companies in Indiana. That's not what I want him to do. He's not a worker, he's a human being. If this is affecting the Catholic schools, it's affecting home schools, you really are taking away our choices if you pass this today. And I thank you very much for your time and for your service to the state.
Matt Medeski. Matt Medeski.
All right, how's everybody doing? I can see the energy level's riveting, so I'll be fast. Our company teaches competitive positioning or strategy, and we tend to teach people to look at the big picture, not the micro, down in the weeds of these standards. So I'm not going there. I'll talk at the broader level about what I think are the biggest implications, and many of the things have already been touched on. Before owning a part of this consulting business that I own, I served our country for 20 years in the Air Force, first as a jet engine mechanic, and then as an air traffic controller, and the last 13 years as a fighter pilot. I have created standards I've written curriculum to fulfill those standards, so I know a little bit about that. I can tell you that aviator over there was more concerned with getting the right math answer than he was with the process to get a number that didn't work in the air. You would want him flying your airplane, not the guy that used these standards to become mathematically literate. I know I'm getting frustrated and I gotta move because she's gonna tell me time and everybody's gonna go, hurry up, little man. So I'm gonna try to hurry. In 7th grade, there was a quote on the wall of my social studies teacher that said, "By nature, all men are created equal. It is learning and practice that set them apart." That's a Confucius standard. I believe that with my heart and soul. I grew up in a small rural town and was told by my parents that life was potentially unfair, but the way to balance that was use our freedom to work hard and to gain an education. I believed in our Constitution as the basis of our opportunity. I believed in our God as the final arbiter of my soul's destination. For the Republicans in the room, in political terms, you could say I was your base. As of this vote and with this lie, you can count me out of your base. You've lost my respect, you've lost my support, and I'm not the only one. The article Governor Pence wrote yesterday for the Star was this year's second biggest lie, right behind Barack Obama's lie that if you like your health care plan, you can keep it. The governor claimed he trusted the people who crafted the standards. Of course, that's easy when you just ignore those who dissent. Most concerning is his trust placed in Ms. Shin, the outsider who led this effort. Ms. Shin hails from the great Midwestern state of California and the hotbed of Midwestern values, the Berkeley campus. Let me read 2 paragraphs and close with a couple questions. America is a great nation and a unique nation. She was founded on the belief and the idea that all people are created equal in the image of God and that from God all Americans derive their inalienable rights. The Constitution and the Bill of Rights are the foundation of this great nation, and the freedoms enjoyed by all Americans are guaranteed by those 2 documents. Let me read you another paragraph. America is an average land, much like other countries around the world. She was formed by imperial white Europeans who immigrated to our eastern shore. Their imperial and somewhat racist views, as evidenced by our history of slavery, formed the foundation for the unfairness that still exists here. Many of these people today rely on an outdated document called the Constitution to continue to impose their unique policies, and most Americans believe that this document should be changed. Here's my question. Based on those paragraphs, who's going to raise their right hand and defend an average nation? It matters what our kids learn. Thank you.
Thank you. Victoria Zink. Victoria Zink. Victoria Zink.
Good morning, all. I just want to say thank you for the opportunity for speaking before you. I come before you as just a mom who's been very, very upset throughout this whole process. I did have the pleasure of speaking with Governor Pence on Saturday at the MS Walk, and one of the things that touched me the most was when he looked at me and he said, "I truly agree with you. Indiana should never have adopted Common Core." That statement alone right there speaks volumes when you can sit there and look at Common Core state standards and you can see the proposed standards that y'all are going to vote on, and you can sit there and go copy paste from here to here what those standards represented over here. The same standards that Governor Pence looked me in the face on Saturday as he walked for myself and my sister with MS and said he agreed that that Indiana should never have adopted Common Core. In saying that, I asked him then why did we copy and paste? Hoosiers were promised. I came away with, when he signed that bill, I came away with, I just felt this ease. I don't know, and I know many parents, all parents, well maybe not all, the majority of parents, especially the troubled parents within Indiana, just had a sigh of relief that, oh my goodness, we've finally been heard. Our children are going to be safe. Looking through these new standards, and again, I can't say I'm looking at them from an educator's point of view, but just looking at them and not even understanding half of the things that they're saying or whatever. I told last Monday when I came home after the meeting that the board meeting that was there, I came home and just cried. My 9-year-old came up to me and he's like, "What's wrong, Mommy?" And I said,
I am just so sad. I mean, today just broke my heart. And I explained to him, and I said, I just want to pull you. He is my two children go to a Catholic, a private school where they've adopted, the Common Core. And he said, well, we can always homeschool. This is a 9-year-old telling me I can homeschool him because he knows how upset I am with this. The thing that I want to leave you with is, do y'all have kids or grandkids, and are your kids actually going to be part of Common Core? Because, President Obama's kids are never going to be touched by Common Core. And I ask that of you. Do you actually have children that are going to be affected by these proposed standards? Because I do, and pretty much everybody else in this room does. And we're not happy about it, and we're scared because of what could possibly happen with our children. Thank you so very much for letting me speak before you.
Kathy Crawford. Kathy Crawford.
Good morning, and thank you for the chance to actually give my opinion. I want to start by saying that these new standards are a step down for Indiana and basically just a cut and paste of Common Core. Indiana's prior standards were superior, and I just urge you to stop and go back to those standards before you go any further. I'd also like to comment that these new standards are stated to have been transparent, and that's just simply not the case, okay? All the public comments should have been posted so that we could see that our concerns were being addressed and what was happening and that you were actually doing this. At the hearings, after not having any public parent concerns addressed before the adoption of Common Core, we finally were given a chance to speak at these public hearings ourselves and given a 3-minute time period that doesn't hardly even give you time to say what you wanted to do. And the total board, this board right here, every single one of you, should have been sitting in on all 3 of those public hearings the whole entire time, because that was the only chance for you to hear what our concerns were. And the few that were there seemed to be so busy doing their little things on their phone and everything else than actually taking our concerns. The fact that those public hearings are no longer available on your website, that we could see, okay, what part of this was addressed? None of it. That's a total sham. I ask for you to stop now, go back to the prior Indiana standards, take the concerns that the parents had, and show us before you give an okay that you have taken those concerns into consideration. And don't just vote yes or no. Say we need to stop. Thank you.
Kate Johnson. Kate Johnson.
Good morning. My name is Kate Johnson. I'm with an organization called Stand for Children here in Indiana. We are a nonpartisan group dedicated to educational advocacy to ensure that all children have access to college and are prepared for college by the time they get there. I just wanted to first take an opportunity to thank all of you, both the Department of Education staff, state board members, and staff, for the countless hours that you all have dedicated through this process to ensure that everything outlined under House Enrolled Act 1427 was carried out very thoroughly. The process was thorough, with thousands of hours by Indiana experts dedicated. It was unfortunate to me, especially as a former public school teacher, that some of the national pundits so heavily criticized the standards and all of the Indiana educators that volunteered so much time to developing and writing these standards. Stand for Children supports the new standards, and we also support the development of the supplemental materials and professional development as voted in the Education Roundtable last week. On the evaluation team alone, it's clear that Indiana experts, 2/3 were made up of both rural, suburban, urban school teachers, and the remaining from colleges and universities, those who understand that the students that they're getting in have near 40% remediation rates. So we believe that the standards will raise the bar for Hoosier students. We would also caution that the next step is a rigorous assessment that really aligns to the standards to make sure that we're truly assessing what the kids are learning. So thank you so much for your time, and good luck with your vote.
Thank you. We are now ready for new business. We have three actions to take. I believe that Danielle and Molly will be doing a presentation, short presentation, and Sam doing a short presentation prior to our vote. Thank you. I believe members of the board have the presentation.
All right, very good. Thank you. Thank you again for allowing us to come before you and share with you this process.
And I'll allow each one of you to introduce yourselves as you
Absolutely,
speak.
yeah. Well, actually, I was going to say we're mixing it up for you a little bit today. We're bringing Sam on board with us, so I am going to let him introduce himself.
Hi, I'm Sam Sneidman. I'm Director of Readiness and Alignment with Indiana's Commission for Higher Education.
Hi, Molly Chamberlain with State Board staff. And Danielle Shockey, Deputy Superintendent, again before you with a presentation on the process for Indiana Academic Standards, English and Language Arts, and Mathematics. I also want to point out that when we get to the discussion part of the agenda today, we do have Suji Shin in the audience, as well as subject matter experts from the Department of Education who are here to answer any questions that you may have that the three of us cannot address. So just want to bring us back to where we started from, which is the State Board of Education is required to adopt college and career ready standards by July 1st, 2014. As we've stated before, it's important to us at the Department of Education, as I know it's important to you, to bring this to a conclusion, as our teachers would love to understand and know what the standards are going to be for them going into the summer. So we're really pleased to be here today in advance of our deadline with what we believe to be incredibly strong standards for students in Indiana. Our presentation goals today are to showcase the undeniable depth and quality in Indiana's process and to highlight the strengths in Indiana's academic standards for English language arts and mathematics. We've been before you many times talking about the process and the involvement of the people, so we're not going to go back and reiterate things that I know you're very well versed in, but we certainly are going to spend a great deal of time today going into examples of how the standards process evolved and how we believe the standards through the process and the strength of what we ended up with took into consideration really strong standards to begin with, expert as well as 2,066 public comments, and iterations of all of those voices are before you in the drafts today. So we want to walk you through that. So that's going to be the bulk of our presentation today. At this time, I am going to let you hear from Sam, because we're really pleased that he's been involved with us from the Commission of Higher Education for most of this process. So Sam's going to talk through some new slides.
Good morning. I bring you greetings from my boss, Commissioner Teresa Lubbers. She would want me to reiterate to you just how privileged we've felt to participate in this process, to work alongside our colleagues on your staff and on the Department of Education staff. As Danielle mentioned, you've already received some briefings on the process we've undertaken, so I wanted to highlight a few key pieces of information rather than go back through the entire process. The work of the teams, which are listed there, the Technical Advisory Evaluation and College and Career Ready teams, they built on each other. That is to say, the CCR panel built on the work of the evaluation team, which built on the work of the technical and advisory teams. It's also worth pointing out that each of the teams has membership from the previous level. So, for example, some of the college and career ready panel members also served on the evaluation team. This was done so that at each level there would be an advocate for and a source of information on the work that had been done by the previous group. 156 educators and industry leaders, including the IDOE subject matter experts, worked in tandem to develop the standards that you have before you for consideration today. This includes higher education professionals representing Indiana's diverse set of educational institutions, not just unselective two-year institutions, right? But incredibly selective institutions in Indiana and Purdue as examples. It also included K-12 educators representing urban, rural, suburban, large and small districts. Industry representatives from STEM and the healthcare fields were particularly important players in our process. And, you know, thousands of hours of work put in by this group. And frankly, I'd also like to acknowledge the hours that were put in by folks who came to testify, who took time out of their lives to come to the hearings that you held, that came to the legislative hearings, that posted public comments, that have sent you emails. I would like to take a moment to say thank you to those folks who certainly played an important part of the process and contributed to the standards that you have for your consideration. You also received copies of the National Evaluator reports. That was an important part of the process, but it was one part of the process. How do you balance the comments of you know, folks as esteemed as Stan Drostotsky and James Milgram against the work of you know, the panelists, and against, frankly, the thousands of teachers and principals and parents who have reached out and provided their own feedback. I think that those are important things to consider, to weigh against one another. Can we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. The panels worked from numerous sets of highly regarded standards. The math teams used Indiana academic standards from 2000 2009, the Common Core state standards, and standards from the National Council of Teachers of Mathematics. The ELA teams used IAS from 2006, the Common Core, and the standards from the National Council of Teachers of English. I know you received a briefing on the process of evaluation and forced consensus, so in the interest of time, I won't rehash that discussion. What is most important, I think, is to keep in mind that the process started with really high quality standards and was guided by a set of principles that I'll turn to now. Indiana's experts, those teams of K-12 educators, higher ed professionals, and industry leaders, were asked to think about what universal knowledge, skills, and abilities Indiana students should know and be able to do in order to be college and career ready. Using this as a lens, these groups of experts were asked to create a set of standards that met 4 qualifications that are listed here on the slide. That they be clear and free of jargon, that they be rigorous, that they be specific, but that they not prescribe instructional strategies or curriculum, and that they progressed from grade level to grade level in a way that made sense. Using the previously described set of standards as a guide or a base, as required by law, the teams, culminating with the CCR panel, put together a set of standards which I believe hit those marks. And I'll now turn it over to Molly and to Danielle to sort of provide explanations and examples.
So I'm going to walk you through kind of how a standard was born and the evolution of an English language arts standard, and then I'm going to turn it over to Danielle, who will actually talk about the evolution of a mathematics standard. So we go to the next slide. This is kind of a flow chart that shows sort of how a standard was born. This started back in October with the technical and advisory teams reviewing the 2010 Common Core state standards and providing feedback on those. It then went to the evaluation teams who looked at the multiple sets of standards that Sam has already mentioned to you. Once the work of the evaluation teams was done, it went back to content specialists at the Department of Education for revision and attempts at articulation, articulation being making sure that a skill isn't introduced at second grade that hasn't been built upon in kindergarten and first grade, and that once you're going up to third grade, that skill is progressing. In addition, there was public comment and public hearings as well as some external review. All of that was rolled into what came to the evaluation team for their second iteration. Past the second iteration of the evaluation team was additional revision done by the IDOE content specialists, as well as some additional external review. That then came to the college and career review panels, who met several times to provide their own input. And something that the college and career ready panels did that has really never been done before was they started at a college or workforce perspective, and they worked all the way back. So from college and workforce to 12th grade, all the way down to 6th grade to 5th grade, down to kindergarten, to make sure that these were aligned. So after having shown you this flow chart, I'm actually going to show you an example of how an English language arts standard was born. So some color coding to keep in mind, and you can refer back to your slides. Some of the things that all through these iterations people were looking for was language that appeared to be redundant. We had had some criticisms of the 2006 Indiana Academic Standards, the English Language Arts Standards, for having redundancy embedded, saying in 3 or 4 standards what could actually be said in 1. They were also looking for standards that might be overly specific, standards that might lead a classroom teacher to think, this is the way I have to teach this, or this is what I have to teach. They were looking for standards that appeared unclear, standards that appeared to be overly complex, what we lovingly call mega standards, where too many things are you're trying to build too many skills into one, and then finally standards that were lacking clear grade progression. So as they moved through, I wanted to start with the final version of 2 grade 3 reading vocabulary standards. The first standard talks about applying context clues and gives examples appropriate for 3rd grade, and text features, examples appropriate for 3rd grade, to determine the meanings of unknown words. And the second standard talks about identifying word relationships. Recognizing word relationships is important for building vocabulary, and this talks about synonyms, antonyms, homographs, homophones, and multiple meaning words, with an example of a 3rd grade appropriate multiple meaning word. To start with in phase 1. So you'll see we've got just a few standards identified here. 6 standards that were identified by the evaluation team as being standards that are necessary in the area of grade 3 vocabulary for a student to be college and career ready. You can see that the source of these standards is multiple. There is a Common Core standard that was selected, talks about using strategies to identify unknown and multiple meaning words. You've got an Indiana academic standard and a Common Core standard, and you can see that these are virtually identical. Talks about using context to find the meanings of words. You have an Indiana academic standard that talks about using synonyms, antonyms, homophones, and homographs, and then another Indiana academic standard that talks about multiple meaning words, and then finally, a Common Core standard that was identified by the group that talks about shades of meaning among words. This is a lot of standards here, and you can see the words that are marked in red were identified as being redundant. We don't need all of these to be listed. So after work was done by the content specialists to look at grade-to-grade articulation, this is what came out. Attempting to consolidate some of those redundant standards into determine or clarify the meaning of unknown or multiple meaning words and phrases based on appropriately complex content, choosing flexibly from an array of strategies and providing to strategies sentence and word context and knowledge of synonyms, antonyms. That should actually say homophones. I apologize, especially to Mrs. Wicker for my improper phrasing there, and homographs, and then distinguishing shades of meaning. So after articulation and public comment, it was determined that standard 1 was a mega standard. There are too many things that you're trying to encompass here, and it was unclear to those who are looking at it from the lens of public comment what we were actually getting at here. In addition, it was unclear to the public how multiple meaning words would progress. So if you're looking at multiple meaning words in 2nd grade and you're looking at multiple meaning words in 4th grade, how do you show that the knowledge is progressing? In addition, in the 2nd standard, there was a lot of public comment that the shades of meaning was unclear and that it needed some additional clarity and definition. So it moved on to phase 3, which was the reconvening of the evaluation teams. And
Using context was actually moved out to be its very own standard. Using context is something that was identified in 2006 Indiana Academic. It was identified in Common Core. It also exists in Nebraska standards, in Texas standards, in Virginia standards. It's a very important skill that students need to have. So context was moved out. We had using context and other strategies to determine or clarify the meanings of grade level appropriate words. So this was actually a source Common Core standard that was edited in order to try to be a little bit more clear. But the CCR panel determined we weren't quite there yet. And I'll tell you what was done on the next slide. The second slide actually went to that shades of meaning that was unclear to the public. And we looked at some other states. And we determined that Nebraska actually did a very good job of showing what we're really trying to get at here. And this is identifying semantic relationships, which is really word relationships. And it's pretty easy to build on word relationships. Synonyms, antonyms, homophones, homographs, these are things that, again, they appear everywhere. It's a pretty universal skill. But we liked the way that this was written in Nebraska, so the Nebraska standard was actually selected. The panels felt that we were close, but the CCR team still felt that it was unclear how using context progressed from second grade to third grade to fourth grade, and was also very unclear on what other strategies. That's too vague, it's too broad. And then finally, multiple meanings, they were still unclear as how does this progress from second grade to third grade to fourth grade. So that's how we got to the final standard. Context clues is kept, but there are examples that are given. Word, phrase, and sentence clues. And text features was added as a strategy that can be important for students to use to be able to identify the meanings of words. Maps, illustrations, and charts. So in actuality, this final standard came from Nebraska, the state of Nebraska, but was slightly edited by our College and Career Ready panel to be very specific and to progress. If you look at second grade, the context that's being used is word and phrase context. And if you look at second grade, text features are a little bit simpler. It's tables of contents and also illustrations. And then in the second example, we still have the word relationships, and we're asking them to identify synonyms, antonyms, homographs, and homophones, which were key skills identified in 2006 Indiana Academic Standards, and also multiple meaning words. Slightly more complex multiple meaning words. In fact, these examples were drawn directly from Indiana's academic standards, puzzle and fire. Back in second grade, we look at a word like duck. So this is trying to show that progression. So this is an example of how a third grade reading vocabulary standard started out at 7, ended up at 2, and was heavily edited by the groups throughout in order to try to meet public comment and then also comments from some of the external evaluators. And now I'm going to turn it over to Danielle, who is going to talk about a grade 4 data analysis standard.
All right, thank you. And I think what I think is really clear to me in Molly's example and the example I'm going to show you is the idea of the globalness of these skills. I don't think any of us would argue that a third grader needs to learn vocabulary and how to use context clues. I don't think anybody could argue with the example I'm going to show you that fourth grade and data analysis is a concept strand in fourth grade. So I think as you see how these evolve, we're starting with strong standards. We are working around this idea of clarity and focus and rigor and grade level progression. But again, the universal knowledge a student has to learn remains pretty much consistent as the past. So a fourth grade standard, and what I want to note with this fourth grade standard is this actually started with the technical team. So if you remember way back, technical review teams started in the fall, and the technical review team's feedback on this was the fact that the standards that existed, which was the Common Core, that was their charge, lacked very, very specific skills at all at grade 4 around data analysis, but rather starting in 5th and 6th grade, it was very heavy. So they said, where's the progression? So their recommendation was that data analysis be added at 4th grade. On this slide, you will see the end product, and I'm going to do just what Molly did, which is walk you through, so you might refer back to your color coding. But this is the final version that was formulated in the end and before you in the draft. Grade 4, students will formulate questions that can be addressed with data, using observations, surveys, and experiments to collect, represent, and interpret the data using tables, including frequency tables, line plots, and bar graphs. Here you can see, and when we worked in the 4 sets of standards, when they were origin-free with the panel, with the evaluation team, What they came back to us with was those that were pluses, and you remember us describing that process to you, the pluses, the minus, and the zeros. So the 7 standards before you here were ones that were brought back as pluses. So just to remind you of the process, that meant that the evaluation team deemed these ideas or concepts to be college and career ready. However, it's not necessary to have 7 different standards because, as you can see in here, there is redundancy. So these are the 7 that all received pluses and that were deemed college and career ready ideas for the students to learn. Next slide, please, Ryan. And then it was determined through the work of the team that there were parts of those 7 standards that could certainly be capsulated into one standard, again, trying to avoid the mega standard idea. So the next step was the subject matter experts of the Department of Education worked after the feedback of the technical teams and the evaluation team to create this standard encompassing all the important ideas. So it became formulate questions that can be addressed using data and make predictions about the data, use observations, surveys, and experiments to collect, represent, and interpret the data using tables, with the example of including frequency, line plots, line graphs, bar graphs, and recognizing the difference in representing categorical and numerical data. Line graphs here is in orange because when this came to the evaluation team, they started looking at grade level progression and realized that line graphs really made more sense in 5th grade because of some of the other standards that existed in 5th grade. So it was moved to be a 5th grade standard. It still exists, but the progression made more sense there. And on the next slide, the evaluation team and the College and Career Ready panel had a discussion around these ideas, that making predictions about the data and recognizing the difference in representing categorical and numerical data also really fit better in 5th grade. So again, an example of how they were very cognizant and aware of looking up and down, K-12 backwards, 4th, 5th, 3rd and below it, and making sure that things made sense. We were always trying to get this idea across of skills are introduced at a grade level, they are practiced for a period of time, and then they become mastered. So at some point, some things had to be moved into different grade levels to achieve that work. And so ultimately, Ryan, we ended with where we started, started with the first slide I showed you. Formulating questions that can be addressed with data, using observations, surveys, and experiments to collect, represent, and interpret the data using tables, including frequency, line plots, and bar graphs. And there we are on how a 4th grade math standard came to be. Next slide, Ryan. So now we're going to switch gears a little bit, and we would certainly be happy when there's discussion time to go into any of that evolution that we just went through very quickly with you. And I know as you've looked at the drafts, you've seen this kind of happening as the last couple of months have unfolded. So I hope all of that made a great deal of sense to all of you. As we finish today with our last couple slides, we want to point out some of the strengths of the standards that you have before you today. Every source standard, every source, and we say this because this means there were thousands of source standards. If you take the fact that the evaluation team and the College and Career Ready team evaluated in its entirety every single NCTM standard, every single 2000 math, every single 2009 math, and the Common Core, they evaluated and discussed and took into incorporating the panel conversations, the 2066 public comments, the 100 public comments. All of those were discussed, edited, rewritten in attempts to bring you College and Career Ready standards. The review and evaluation panels incorporated, as I just said, all of those people's input. And then as we received the national reviewers' comments, they were also incorporated into this work. There was not one expert recommendation document that came before us that was not read by multiple sources. And I can also tell you that almost every single one has something in this work that you have before you. So it was never disregarded. But there were times when our Hoosier experts said this does not make sense for our Hoosier standards. And I want to give you an example. And I think maybe we brought this example before you before, but I think it's important to note that there were really great feedback that came from a variety of sources. But when some of the feedback comes and says that in early literacy in kindergarten, it's not important to teach the skill of reading front to back or left to right, our Hoosier experts said, no, that is important to us. So we did take into consideration every comment, and we sometimes chose to disregard for purposes that the panel felt strongly about. Want to note here too, some of the strengths of the standard are ELA across content standards. That means that in science and social studies, there are English language arts standards that are being brought forth in these drafts to you, so that a science and a social studies teacher who's teaching a research paper or teaching how to, do good bibliographies, understand how that links to the ELA curriculum. So that is a part of the standards before you also. Media literacy standards are also incorporated, and we looked at other states who have had well-regarded standards and well-regarded student progress. Media literacy does stand alone, so the panels felt that was strong to keep into Indiana. This used to exist in speaking and listening. Individual math courses. This is the first time ever. This roundtable recognized, and many of you, I don't know, have been here before ELA and math in the past, but if you haven't, you may or may not know that math actually stopped at Algebra 2 in the standards that were brought before you. Our standards actually take into consideration individual math courses of trig, calc, pre-calc, finite, and data and statistics. So before you, for the first time, are standards that increase the rigor and the course content for our students. Also, for the first time ever, because of the K-12 and the college and career ready perspective that Sam and Molly described, where our college and career ready panelists said, we are sitting outside of the K-12 spectrum. We're looking back on your work, and for students to be college and career ready, this is what we feel they need to know. We just didn't stop with that. We actually went to something called the Course Transfer Library, which is what is used at the high school level for the students to also get college level credit for courses in high school. And we aligned our standards and made sure there was grade level progression with the syllabi of all those courses. Again, that's never happened before, but we think that speaks to the strength of this process and the College and Career Ready panel's work. And then finally, we also are really pleased to share with you that the College and Career Ready panel had a process at the very end of this for which they deemed the work for which they worked upon, meaning if they sat on the ELA team and they worked on the ELA standards, they signed off to deeming these college and career ready. Again, they were telling us that if this student comes to my job or to my classroom, they should be more than ready to succeed and not in need of remediation, which was the goal for college and career ready standards. We've talked a lot about next steps, and Sarah, you brought forth a resolution at the last meeting about the next steps in this process. Regardless of what happens here today, we need to help this transition happen in the classroom, and our families and our stakeholders need to know what is going to happen next. So I want to share a little bit of examples of what's going to happen next, and I also want to share that we've already started a survey. So when the standards draft went out 2 weeks ago through the DOE dialogue and to all of you, that we put a survey with it for schools, teachers, administrators, curriculum directors to give feedback regarding what is it going to take if these are your standards that are adopted, what do you need? What do you need the department to do to support your work? And so far we have received 1,286 comments on that survey, and the top 3 things that they're telling us they will need is they would like rubrics for lesson planning, a lesson planning alignment, they would like model content frameworks, and then they would like new digital content to support these new standards. And there's actually a menu of 12 or 15 items, and those are the top 3 that have come to the top. And I say that because I want to point out, we will, as with any standards adoption at the Department of Education, put out support materials. But in this case, we're taking it one step further, and we're saying we want to differentiate for you. So schools, teachers, what is it that is most important to you? And then we will develop our summer work, our direct professional development around the needs of the schools. So some of the things that are listed here in the first bullet point are things, like I said, we always do upon adoption of standards. We will create glossaries that support common vocabulary that exists in these ELA and math standards. We will come up with exemplar reading text lists by grade level based on feedback from the field. You know, what is it that a second grade teacher across Indiana thinks is an important book to use to reach the standards that are in second grade ELA. So we will come up with those text lists, again, as options for schools if they'd like them as a resource. We will have rubrics, as I mentioned, with the input from the teachers, but also not just rubrics that support the transition and the crosswalk between the standards that we currently are using and these new standards, but even rubrics around things like materials. So a school can assess, okay, this is what we have in our math closet, what may we have or what may we need to support the standards that are adopted, hopefully here today. We also are going to continue to have clear communication, and we recognize that the clear communication is not just with the educators, that the communication is the stakeholders, the communication is the parents, the communication is the business community, and continuing this wonderful relationship we now have with the college and career ready groups, that's very important. So we recognize this implementation that we want to stay engaged with them. And I do want to end with a few lines from a letter from Achieve from the President Mike Cohen regarding the final draft. And I think this is a misconception that's important to point out. Achieve did take a look at our final draft. And the letter that was sent to both you and the roundtable, and this was actually sent in advance of the roundtable, but he says, I want to be clear about our view.
Indiana's proposed standards are strong, worthy of adoption, and should be advanced to the State Board of Education. In both English language arts and mathematics, the standards are anchored in research that identifies the knowledge and skills necessary for college and career readiness. The standards are rigorous and present appropriate challenges at every grade level with a clear progression from grade to grade. They provide the focus, clarity, and specificity teachers need to help guide effective classroom instruction. By moving these standards forward, the Indiana State Board of Education, you will not only be taking one step closer to having a very strong set of educational standards, but you will end the uncertainty that has left parents, teachers, and students in limbo. So again, I thought that was a very strong statement coming from Achieve and really highlights the work that we've been bringing before you all these months, and I hope that you will support at the end of the discussion today.
Thank you very much. Now before us is the motion. I move to adopt the Indiana Academic Standards for Mathematics 2014 as recommended by the Education Roundtable. Is there a second?
I second.
Any more discussion?
We are about to vote on math standards that leading mathematicians have described as poorly written, disorganized, and erroneous. Although many of the complaints have revolved around the high school courses, problems begin in grade 1. Consider this first grade math standard. Demonstrate fluency with addition facts and the corresponding subtraction facts within 20. Use strategies such as counting on, making 10, decomposing a number leading to a 10, using the relationship between addition and subtraction, and creating equivalent but easier or known sums. It continues, all in a single standard. Professor Milgram has called that standard a monstrosity. After reading the math standards for grades 5 and 6, Professor Hung-Shi Wu, the University of California, wrote, "I found that I could not go on because the amount of mathematical illiteracy hurt my mathematical sensibility." Professor Alexander Hahn of Notre Dame found subpar language in geometry and algebra 2. Professor Milgram listed numerous concerns in trigonometry and calculus. Their complaints are too many to summarize today. Bottom line, expert mathematicians Milgram, Wu, and Hahn have advised us we should not accept these standards. At minimum, we should consider delaying adoption of the math standards so we can improve them and fix the errors. We have until July 1. It is malpractice to adopt math standards that make no sense to mathematicians.
Any more discussion? Is there any more discussion? Is there any more discussion? Brad? Mr. Oliver?
Thank you. I'd like to make a couple comments just in general on the standards, and want to start by first of all saying how appreciative I am of everybody's participation, whether they were a member of the panels or whether they were somebody that's been here to testify, and several of the public comment opportunities that have occurred along the way, and not just through the public hearings, but also even through the written public comments. There was a statement made earlier about whether or not the people who are sitting in front of you on the board, who they represent. And I want to talk from the heart just for a second, because there are people on this board who are very well qualified. They are educators, but we are also parents, and we're neighbors. Many of you that even testified, I consider personal friends. Doesn't mean we always agree, but we're personal friends. But I want to tell you some things that I've observed, and as I've listened to this debate for some time, I've been concerned about it because I was concerned about the way in which, at the federal level, it seemed that they were taking advantage of the opportunity to invade a little bit more into the right of Indiana to govern its education system. And that's why one of the reasons I was so passionate early on in the fall about us going through this process and starting with our requirement under 1427 to evaluate Common Core. But I want to make some observations, and I would say this: as I've watched and listened, it seems that fear sometimes can outpace fact. And I've heard a lot of fear, and I understand that. And I have some fears as well, and I'd like to share a few of those with you. One of the fears that I have is that politics has been interjected into this discussion to a point that it's actually shaded our ability to actually think clearly about what's in front of us. For me, today is not a vote about Common Core, it's a vote about the standards that are going to set the state test, that are going to influence how we teach and the types of curriculum materials we adopt locally. And the reason I say that is because when I hear public comment about there's too much copy and paste, I think we're asking the wrong question. As I've spent the last several weeks going through looking at previous drafts, looking at the final draft, the question I keep coming back to that I ask myself is, do these statements reflect the most critical knowledge and skills that our children need? And I've said that thinking about my colleagues on this board who have very young children, and I've thought about it myself who have children at the other end that are finishing up and they're in high school. And I've thought about the children that we serve, not just in my district, but in all of your districts. And I think that's the question before us. I have considered the National Review comments. I've looked at the Indiana educators. Sometimes it was very confusing. And when I read things like, we just need to simply let them read and underline the most significant part of the passage, I question whether or not that alone will be enough for them to enter into a world where they need to be able to synthesize information and make sense of it and be able to do something with that information. I'm concerned when I hear people say a skill that a child needs and explain that that's bad pedagogy when pedagogy is about how we teach something and not necessarily what a child is supposed to know and do. I fear a little bit about the fact that we've forgotten that the reason we're here is because we were seeing a number of students go to college not ready, and it was costly to see them be remediated. And while I would probably not have chosen to go down the path of Common Core to begin with, as has been expressed by others, I am grateful for the fact that our state has led in the ability to take a pause and step back and do that evaluation again and ask ourselves the fundamental question of whether or not these standards are the right ones. I am very grateful that Governor Pence and even Superintendent Ritz signed a letter to get us out of the PART consortium. Because as a former teacher in a classroom and a former building principal, I can tell you that when you attach high stakes accountability to a test, the content of the test influences teacher behavior in classroom teaching just as much as the standard and perhaps more. I am very grateful that by adopting our own standards, we're now on a path to thinking about our own state assessment, where we'll set those parameters, not some national body that's setting a national exam that would influence what happens in a classroom. I fear that if that would have happened, and I am grateful for the leadership that has stopped that. I'm fearful that when we hear passion and we hear people talk about things like shoddy standards and sham and other words like that that are negative and pejorative in nature, that it doesn't speak volumes to the dedication and the expertise of the teachers in the state and the subject matter experts who were not paid but volunteered over 6,000 hours to pour through thousands of comments and hours of public input, and who I personally sat and watched in the CCR panels wrestle with not whether this was Common Core or not Common Core, but is this the right standard and how do we know it? And is it in the right grade level? And is there a better way to articulate it so that our kids can be successful when we actually go to see if they actually have mastery of this? And I guess last and finally, as we think about both the math standards and the English language arts standards, the thing that I'm most concerned about is, do our parents and our constituents understand the important role they play at the local level? When I hear folks stand and passionately talk about the impact of standards on their students, they oftentimes cite a worksheet or something that happened in the classroom. But what that says to me is that we have a long way to go to help continue to help people differentiate between a standard that articulates what a child needs to know and do, and the freedom and the local autonomy of school districts to adopt resource materials and govern the curriculum that will ultimately guide the teaching instruction that happens in the classroom. And I don't ever want to see a day where the state board starts to define all the way down to describing exactly what has to be used to get a standard taught and learned. And so I would just simply say this, as we approach this process of standards adoption, I've wrestled from it from the standpoint of making sure that we get the right standards. But I'm going to be very grateful in advance to the people in this room, as well as many that are not here today, teachers, parents, community leaders, for the job that they have to do now, which is at their local level, is make sure that their curriculum is strong and that the instructional materials are appropriate. If we stand back here and we say in a few years that it wasn't right, it won't necessarily be because of the standard. It would be because we chose to sit out on a very important dialogue that happens locally about the kind of adopted materials that we're going to put in front of our students. And that's a local decision that I strongly believe is best left with local decision makers to make. Thank you.
Any more comments, discussion? Gordon?
First, let me say that I'm the proud parent of a 6-year-old daughter who attends kindergarten at the Indianapolis Public Schools here in downtown Indianapolis. and an almost 2-year-old son who will soon follow. I have a vested interest in the success of Hoosier public education. I want them both to be prepared for success in the real world, whether that be here in Indiana, in another state, or across the globe. I'm pleased that we can finally bring this debate to a close and adopt a set of standards that I believe will prepare Hoosier students for success beyond graduation. It's important to note, however, that the standards alone will not prepare our students. We must continue the hard work of making sure all of our schools are performing at high levels, and that our parents and students, the consumers of the policies that we set here, have all the information they need to find a school that meets their needs. Finally, I hope that with this conversation behind us, we can stick with these standards and make sure that we're not continuously moving the goalposts on our students and educators. The reasons academic standards have been successful in places like Massachusetts is because legislators and policymakers picked a direction and stayed with it. Thank you.
Any other discussion?
Thanks for all your good work, and my colleagues also mentioned the good work of thousands of people and passionate testimony from people today. It really makes a difference. As we appear to reach closure, there are some unanswered questions that I hear over and over and over in emails and people approaching me. So I just like responses to some of these questions so we can reach closure and hopefully finally move on. First question is, how do you explain the similarity between the Indiana standards and Common Core standards?
Sure. And we'll kind of tag team, if that's okay.
Sure.
As presented to you before, the 2000 and the 2009 mathematics standards and the 2006 English language arts standards were rated as an A. We know that. They were highly regarded. So when the CCSO and the National Governors Association came together to work on the Common Core, Indiana's standards were some of those that were brought forth for that organization to use. And much like we didn't start with a blank sheet of paper, they didn't either. They started with standards that existed, standards that were regarded as high, and they took those into consideration. So as you try to peel back the onion of Common Core and see what some of the origin sources are, Indiana standards before them existed. So to say here today, and not to mention that 1427 required of us to use Common Core as our base of this evaluation too. But much of the Common Core standards were Indiana academic in part.
I can add to that the sort of the universal concepts of standards, and I'll stick with English language arts, but you know, talking about, for example, in reading literature, and I know that one of the national reviewers that we had was quite critical of the reading literature standards, and almost went so far as to suggest that analysis of literature began with Common Core. And actually, if you go back and you look at the 2006 Indiana academic standards, something like retelling a story from beginning, middle, and end, and paying attention to sensory details actually exists in 2006 Indiana academic. It was actually written as 3 standards that I think it exists in the Common Core kind of as one standard. If you look at Nebraska, a state that has its own standards, they have the exact same concept, retelling the story. It's important getting it beginning, middle to end, and paying attention to sensory details. Texas has an entire section of its literature standards on paying attention to sensory details when retelling a story. And then Virginia is another example of a state that has its own standards, and they have an entire section on retelling stories in logical order and paying attention to sensory details. So all of these being kind of critical skills that students need to know and be able to do, you know, in order to be, I guess, college and career ready.
So in summary, you're saying the Indiana standards came before the Common Core standards, and actually Common Core adopted some of the Indiana standards, and now it's coming full circle and we're getting them back? Is that the response?
That, as well as what Molly shared, which is a lot of this is universal skills or concepts. So you would expect to continue to see the example she gave in any set of standard. So yes, in the Common Core it existed, and yes, in our draft standard it does exist as well. But to your point, in summary, yes, essentially that is what we're saying.
And I guess the last thing I would add is the work that was done by the panel, you know, in addition to everything that we've described, was specifically looking at grade level progression, specificity, clarity, you know, and also trying to avoid standards being overly specific in a way that might actually prescribe instruction. So, you know, some of the In some cases, you might see a standard that originated with Indiana Academic, but it doesn't necessarily look like it did in Indiana Academic because it was edited for progression or for clarity. You might see a standard that started out in Common Core has been edited for grade level progression, actually moved from this grade down to this grade or up to this grade. You might see standards that come from, Nebraska or Texas or Virginia that were really just, they said it a little bit better. They were a little bit better fit in terms of that specificity and clarity and grade level progression.
Next question deals with curriculum. There's been a number of people who have come forward to read us passages from, I think, totally inappropriate English language arts materials, a lot of questions about mathematic concepts and so forth and so on. And I've always made the distinction between standards and curriculum. What we're approving are standards. The curriculum and specific instructional materials will happen at the local level. And I see you shaking your head, so I assume that is a yes. Many school districts in Indiana have already accepted and moved on curriculum materials that are aligned with Common Core. And I'm wondering whether or not they're going to throw away all of those Common Core materials and bring in something else based on the new standards that we've adopted. Do you have any comment about that, that even if we approve the Indiana standards, that they're going to implement Common Core anyway?
Well, I hope they will certainly be using the standards for which we adopt. But I can tell you from my classroom experience and obviously being a school administrator that materials are just that in a lot of cases. They are materials. How you choose to use them is up to you. And ultimately, if I'm an elementary teacher and I have a set of manipulatives around telling time and geometry and counting and so forth, math concepts, those are going to be universal materials. Now, in terms of textbooks, yes, did textbook companies come out and put a stamp on the front of their textbook that said these are aligned? But again, they are aligned to universal skills that students need to be able to know and do. So does vocabulary exist in probably every literature textbook, reading textbook? Yes. So we will provide support materials to the locals that will give them a rubric, as I described, to say, okay, if this is what you have, kind of lay this rubric over top of your adopted materials. Will it fulfill these key ideas? And if so, you're probably fine. Or if it's most of these, the materials that you have will also work. We don't anticipate that there's not going to be many materials in the classrooms that will not work with the standards that we have before you today.
And David, I might also say we have a third resolution here today that's going to deal with making sure that we're going to align materials and give guidance to the field.
Okay, in a non-Common Core way with
Correct.
the Indiana students.
Yes,
Let me ask
with
you a
our
few more
standards.
questions, and I don't want to dominate, but I feel this is an opportunity to ask some key questions. Regarding ACT, and of course we want our colleague to have a chance to speak also, it's important that our students who are on the college level path are able to move into college of their choice by taking the ACT test. And there's been a question that if the ACT is essentially aligned with Common Core, are we putting our Indiana students at a disadvantage by adopting Indiana standards that are distinct from Common Core standards?
Sure, I think that the folks that make the ACT and the SAT, they've tried to sort of deflect or parry away that question.
That's why I'm asking you.
Yeah, well, I'm gonna. Maybe I've heard the messaging too much, but I'm gonna try to do something similar, I guess. The reality is that those tests are aligned to measuring knowledge and skills that kids are going to need to be ready in college. And I think that this goes along with what Molly and Danielle have mentioned about the universality of these knowledge and skills. What Indiana and Purdue and Notre Dame and all Indiana institutions want to see in their potential prospective students is that they are ready to do college level ELA and mathematics work without remediation. And I believe that those same skills that we're going to try to teach using these standards are going to be the same that you would get from Common Core, that you would have gotten from Indiana Academic, that you'd get from Nebraska, that you'd get from my former residents of Texas. That all those kids from all those other states are going to get the same skills and knowledge that we're going to get out of these standards too.
So you're saying Indiana standards will exceed those of Common Core and our students will be better prepared? Is that what you're saying?
If you're asking me sort of personally to represent my personal opinion?
No, I'm asking you to represent the Board of Higher Ed, which you're here today to
Yes.
represent them. right?
I believe that they will be as prepared or better prepared, yes.
Okay. Last question is, the learner sort of gets lost in all this sometimes, and we hear, I mean, that's why we're here. We're focusing in on the learner. And sometimes with all the political things that happen and so forth and so on, I want to be sure we focus in on the learner. How is this going to make a difference to the Hoosier learner throughout the state of Indiana if we do adopt these Indiana standards?
I think as I talked about the various stakeholder groups for implementation, I did fail to mention the students. And I have 3 daughters at home, and so I actually talk about my work at home a lot. And so I do wonder what the average learner understands about a standard. You know, their teachers talk to them about learning objectives of the lesson, the goals of the lesson for the day, but do they really understand that a standard is behind this? And do they understand that to be college and career ready, I need to learn this body of information, or I may be at risk for remediation in my job or my career path? So yes, we want to have some very specific implementation around the learner as the audience. What that is yet to be, we're looking to some other states with best practices, but I do think that's one group we want to focus on to help the student, particularly a high school and a middle school student, to understand that these are college and career ready. If I am missing some of these key elements as evidenced by the assessment that will follow these adoptions, that I'm at risk. So I do think the learner end of this is something we do want to actually key in on to a little bit better than we have in the past.
Okay, great, thank you. Thank you, Superintendent.
Other discussion? Yeah, Dan?
Just thank you for letting me speak. I've been taken with the number of comments. They receive email and letters, and people have even stopped by to visit me, which was good, and we've had a lot of presentations. And this is really our solution if we want to upgrade performance in Indiana. We need parents and grandparents who care deeply like this. Pediatricians, parents, grandparents, neighbors, other people who take care and concern over children. And frankly, I'm probably the longest serving board member. I can't think of an exception where they haven't been very respectful of what's been written. You know, sometimes when people disagree with you, they start questioning your heritage and intelligence and other things. So I've appreciated that as well. I do want that energy to stay with the issue of education. I think these standards have been caught up in some other, well, we were talking about context of literature. I had to draw the corollary to the standards discussion about some other concerns people have, the role of federal government, government in general, et cetera. If that energy will stay on curriculum, on materials, a lot of these standards are very easy to understand. You can actually look them up, and we could have all of our children show up to kindergarten counting to 100 quite ably, and some other neat things in these standards. Some are full, every profession, whether it's the pediatrician or the airplane jet pilot, or we have our vernaculars. And so some of this is little education-ese, I'll have to admit. But as we use the standards, we'll unpack them, and we'll know, and we'll get better at it. We'll get better at writing standards, we'll get better at using them, we'll get better at selecting material. So I say, while this has been a bit emotional, and I think sometimes, you know, these standards are a spine. They're not the body, the character, the heart and soul of a human person. They're just not just, I don't minimize, they are a spine of what we will teach. So a lot more will be taught, and how we structure the education and how much playground time we get and how we teach is going to take vigilance. We're all going to have to work hard at it together. So I say stay involved on issues that will be equal and probably more important than this spine of standards for our schools. The folks that are concerned about this are not the problem. They're part of the solution. We need more people with energy and interest in what the future of our culture and our society and the economy depends on our character of our children. That will be the tell of the tape of how we live together, economically, socially, and culturally. So thanks for your involvement. Stay involved. I think, frankly, there are other very, very large, probably bigger issues if we want to raise the performance of our children and the character. So thank you.
Carrie?
As Brad mentioned, you know, we're parents on the board, we're taxpayers on the board, we're educators on the board, and so I always view myself as the classroom teacher. I'm the representative of that. And I'm a representative of all the teachers who are back in the classroom who can't come today because they're ISTEP testing and working with their kids and stuff. And so as I've talked to them, and to be honest, sent dozens of people copies of the standards, back in July, requested when Superintendent Ritz offered some people to be on some of the advisory panels and took her up on it, and she very graciously allowed them to be. Sat in with them on some webinars in August, September, kept sending them back draft standards, got lots of text messages over the weekend from all of the people I'd sent the standards to and all of the people who were on the advisory panels, and took all of their feedback, and just really feel like all of their input, I appreciate it, because I appreciate that this time as we're looking at the standards, more people are looking at it than ever before. Some years the standards have slid through with nary a glance, and so, you know, the fact that all of these people care, I appreciate it, and they all can't be here to say that they appreciate the standards. They appreciate the process. They appreciate the increase in rigor level. But as an educator, they also tell me it's time to make some decisions and move on. Could we pause and look for another year? I've had people ask, what if we pause? Is everybody happy in another year? I'm not sure that everybody's happy in another year. You can't get millions of Hoosiers to all agree, but we can agree in the process being open. We can agree that lots of people had input in the process more than ever before. We can agree that we all care about kids. We all want what's best for them. And so I appreciate all of that time and all of that effort and all of that energy, but at the same time, you know, Indiana's teachers are ready to know what we're going to teach so we can spend our summer, our free time making lessons for the kids and teaching them in creative ways so that our kids learn the standards. It's time for us to pick an assessment, which will really drive, as Brad said, that will drive some of the instruction, because that's how our students are going to be held accountable. And so I appreciate the time, I appreciate the energy, I appreciate the effort. I also appreciate that we need to make a decision, and that we'll do that with not just with everybody that has spoken to us and all of their energy in mind.
Tony?
I don't know. I just feel as though maybe we should be careful not to overemphasize standards as a factor in academic success. I mean, whether we're talking about the standards in Singapore, Massachusetts, Indiana, wherever, I mean, the standards can be great, but regardless of the standards, you are always going to have high achieving students and lower achieving students. And regardless of what we do, that reality will persist unless we really identify what are the key ingredients to moving a student from low achieving to high achieving. The standards aren't a ceiling. I mean, they're a floor. I mean, we shouldn't really get in the mindset of thinking that we should ordain here from the state that all kids graduate as rocket scientists. It's just not fair. It's probably not fair to the kids. It's not fair to the teachers. Not fair to the parents. I mean, we're talking about a level of competency whereby they can get a job, go to college, and not be remediated. But by no means are we necessarily talking about these are the kids that are going to be high achieving or innovators. That takes more work. That is beyond, I think, what these standards, and really for a lot of us, and teachers and parents, that's what we're pushing for our own kids. I don't want my kids just to know the standards. I'm not bound by the standards as a parent. There are going to be plenty of things I teach my kids that don't have anything to do with Indiana standards. And I encourage everyone to do that. Don't be bound by Indiana standards, because the factor, at least in my experience, with my 3 kids, that really is critical from taking kids to being lower achieving and higher achieving is the parental involvement. It's setting a structure whereby the kids are focused, committed on a daily basis, time spent on task to whatever the assignment is. And that is where we're gonna see the kind of outcomes that we really want as a state, is when we put equal importance on the education and support of education that's going on inside the home as we put on what's going on in the schools. Thank you.
Any other discussion? Seeing none, if we could have the roll call, please. We're voting on mathematics standards, 2014.
Mr. Albert?
Yes.
Mr. Elsner?
Yes.
Dr. Freitas?
Yes.
Mr. Hendry?
Yes.
Ms. Neal?
No.
Thank you. Mrs. O'Brien?
Yes.
Dr. Oliver?
Yes.
Mr. Walker?
Yes.
Mr. Watts?
Yes.
Mrs. Wicker?
Yes.
Superintendent Ritz?
Yes. The motion carries. Next, I move to adopt the Indiana Academic Standards for English Language Arts 2014 as recommended by the roundtable. Is there a second?
Second.
More discussion? Please
If I-
take the roll call.
If I could, Madam
Oh,
Chairman.
so sorry, BJ.
As a classroom teacher, I teach 5th grade, and I know we have lots of experts that come in, and I appreciate all of you, but what carries the most weight with me are the people that teach beside me and teach around the corner from me and teach in the counties beside people that I really respect and I really admire and I look up to and I try to be like. And I set all of these standards to those appropriate people, from kindergarten to calculus. And while I know that there's never going to be a consensus among everyone, the people that are in the field aren't ready to just get it over with. They're excited about these standards. And I'm not talking about half of them or 70% of them. Every person that I talked to said they were precise, they were on point, they were on grade level, and they're ready to use them. And these are the people that are going to be instituting and doing what they do best, which is enhance the life of students. So while I appreciate those that agree with me and those that disagree with me, I hope that you understand that everyone up here, I have 2 students, 2 little boys of my own, that while we may not agree, I assure you that everyone sitting here is trying to do what they think is right. Certainly respect differing opinions, but the people that are instituting these every day are excited about them, and I am proud.
Any more discussion? Thank you, BJ.
They're excited about them and proud. I'm proud to have been a part of it because I honestly feel that we're doing the right thing, and I'm proud to support it. And with that, I'll second your motion.
Thank you. Any more discussion on the language arts? Andrea?
I am a pirate with a wooden leg. This is the title of a lesson plan I use each year when I introduce my 7th grade students to the language of Shakespeare. The students march around school, dragging their bad legs behind them and stomping the meter. I am a pirate with a wooden leg. This helps them recognize and appreciate the most common rhythm in English poetry, iambic pentameter. That particular lesson plan comes from the Folger Shakespeare Library. Go to the library's website and you will read, there are no Common Core standards associated with this lesson plan. If the board adopts the Indiana College and Career Ready standards today, the Folger will no doubt have to add, there are no Indiana standards connected with this lesson plan. The standards before us today are not uncommonly high. They will diminish the role of literature in the English classroom. And it is the reading of good literature, more than anything else, that will turn our children into critical thinkers and critical writers. Isn't that what we mean when we say college and career ready? As an English teacher myself, I find these standards less rigorous than the Common Core and our previous 2006 ELA standards. And I believe adopting them will drop us to the bottom of the 50 states in standards quality. Kathleen Porter McGee of the College Board says Indiana has gutted the Common Core of its strongest elements, renamed what remains, and is poised to adopt a skills-heavy, content-light, text-neutral document. These are the three glaring weaknesses that will in the long run harm our children. These standards are empty skill sets. Standards are supposed to provide guidelines for what children should know and be able to do. In these standards, there's lots of doing but very little knowing. There is no standard, for example, that would guarantee high schoolers who are exposed to Shakespeare, Chaucer, or other role models of English literature. There are multiple standards that require our children to use technology, promote divergent and creative perspectives, and work with peers to promote collegial discussions. The focus on skills instead of knowledge leads to excessive repetition of the same expectations at virtually every grade level, with no increase in difficulty. These standards lack literary, linguistic, and historic content. They lump all literature together with no separate strands for drama, myth, classics, legend, or poetry. They treat fiction and nonfiction as equally worthy. This was a complaint of the Common Core, of course, but the Indiana drafters have made things worse. The Common Core requires high school students to read 18th, 19th, and early 20th century foundational works of American literature. Indiana has removed that standard. There is no listing of exemplar texts or authors. In a standards document written by Hoosiers for Hoosiers, you expect to see names of revered Hoosier authors, yet there is no mention of James Whitcomb Riley, Booth Tarkington, Gene Stratton Porter, or Kurt Vonnegut. These standards are text neutral. They make no effort to guide teachers in what children should be reading. The Common Core at least asks students to analyze foundational U.S. documents of historic and literary significance, including the Declaration of Independence, the Preamble, Bill of Rights, Lincoln's second inaugural. The new Indiana standards refer to seminal U.S. and world texts, making no qualitative distinction between our Constitution and, say, the United Nations Charter. At a time when our country reports high rates of civic illiteracy, we should be prioritizing these founding documents, not treating them as equals among unnamed world texts of dubious merit. The purpose of standards is to bring uniformity to what is taught and assessed in K-12 schools. Resource guides, supplemental materials don't cut it. If Indiana values the teaching of classic novels or historic texts, it must say so in the standards. We'd be wise in this situation to apply the Hippocratic Oath, first do no harm. I have no doubt that excellent high school literature teachers across Indiana will continue to expose students to Dickens and Twain, Tennyson and Shakespeare, and there will be no harm. But what about teachers fresh out of ed school? What about teachers who are directed by principals to write on their whiteboard the standards they are teaching that day? They will not risk a lesson in iambic pentameter if there is no standard that is connected to it. The loss of literature in the English classroom will deprive the next generation of knowledge and values that are their entitlement. I urge the board to vote no and reinstate our 2006 standards.
Is there any more discussion? Is there any more discussion? Take the roll call, please. Roll call, please.
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Mr. Hendry.
Yes.
Ms. Neal.
No.
Mrs. O'Brien.
Yes.
Dr. Oliver.
Yes.
Mr. Walker.
Yes.
Mr. Watts.
Yes.
Mrs. Wicker.
Yes.
Superintendent Ritz.
Yes. There's a third resolution before us from the roundtable. You've all received a copy of it. It's regarding a resolution regarding exemplary materials to be sent out to educators as they begin to inform their curricular work for these standards. You have read that and you have it before you. I move to adopt the Education Roundtable's resolution as presented. Is there a second?
Madam Superintendent, second.
Any discussion? David?
This is the question about curriculum materials and what we're going to use and recommend to local school districts. And the influence we exert on local school districts by creating this resource guide will be substantial. I would like to see some kind of a process whereby whatever is developed, that we receive some public testimony to it, and that be brought back to us. for a vote before it is being sent out. The specific books that we recommend and so forth, that's been the gist of a lot of conversation with a number of passionate people. And frankly, I'm unwilling to give carte blanche to have our staff create a resource guide that represents us, that is then sent out with us formally approving it. And so at this point, I will not vote for it unless there's a caveat put into this motion that requires the resource guides to come back to us for a vote and approval.
I have a quick question to
Was
that.
that a
same
motion
point.
to amend, or?
Is that not part of the resolution? When I was at the roundtable, it was my understanding that that is to go back to the roundtable, and before June 15th, would that then not come back here? I guess I'm asking a point of clarification on the resolution.
So let's review what it says now, therefore be it resolved, and then we can have more discussion. Now, therefore, be it resolved that the roundtable recommends that the board adopt a process on April 28th, 2014 for the department and staff from CC to develop exemplary standards resource guides that are grade level and subject matter appropriate and of appropriate breadth and complexity. And now, therefore, be it resolved that the roundtable recommends that the standards resource guides aligned with the academic standards recommended by the roundtable on April 21, 2014 shall be submitted to the roundtable and the board for review in advance of June 15th, 2014. And therefore be it resolved that the roundtable recommends that the standards resource guides shall be distributed by the department to teachers, administrators, school boards, and roundtable and the board, and made available on the department's internet website no later than July 1, 2014. And now therefore be it resolved that the roundtable recommends that the department reports at least once annually to the roundtable and the board on the development and continuous updating of standards resource guides across all content areas.
It's such a hot issue, it does not say in there that we actually approve the resource guides. Is that correct? Can you reread that language?
It says that the roundtable recommends that the board adopt a process on April 28, 2014 for the department and the staff from CC to develop exemplary standards resource guides that are grade level and subject matter appropriate and of appropriate breadth and complexity.
So I would make a friendly motion to add approve. The state board will approve these guides prior to being distributed to local school districts. Is there a second?
I'm willing to second that, but I thought it was already in there when you read the line about June 15th. Could you reread that?
We are, I think what this is referring to is that the department with staff from CC are going to develop exemplary standard resource guides at the grade level appropriate. And then it is to come before the roundtable and the board for review in advance of June 15th.
That's the purpose of my motion. It's much different for review versus a formal approval. And that's what I'm asking to add approve and approval. So that we're very clear and on what we're going to be submitting to public schools.
I'd be happy to second that amendment.
May I ask David another question real quick?
So we have an amendment to the resolution to put in where it says, shall be submitted to the roundtable and the board for review and approval in advance of June 15th, 2014. And we have a second. Dan, discussion on the amendment?
Discussion on the amendment, and you said something else, David, and I just want to make sure. There's a couple things. First of all, these are recommendations, so some literature will be chosen, other places won't. But you also talked about hearings in the process. Is that assumed, Superintendent, that we get input from folks about these materials, or is that not part of this process? I don't know.
It's not part of this resolution in any way.
It's not that it wouldn't be, you don't envision
No.
that part of it. I wanted to make that clear, but that isn't part of your,
No,
you just want to approve.
It isn't, because these are recommendations to public schools, and I would hope at the local level there'd be some kind of a review discussion process at that level. But I
Aren't
still
they going
think
to be
it's
recommendations to all schools, not just public schools?
Let's kind of clear the air here. What's being presented is not required. What's
Yeah,
being
I will make that
presented
very clear.
are recommendations to schools, because at the local level, they do their own curriculum. And this board has no power to dictate what local curriculum will be. But we always put resource guides out and information regarding the standards to the field, and the department always does that. The roundtable felt that they wanted to see and review those as the board, and so that is perfectly fine. But that's something that always happens, and they are what you just said, Troy. They are recommendations. They are lists where local schools can choose to use or not to use or add to or whatever they wish to do. Very similar to what we're doing with the social studies standards now. So it is meant to enhance the standards, and local curricular groups will work with those as needed.
So I wanted to make that clear.
Sure.
Madam Superintendent, I was just asking if I could, I think Claire's trying to add a helpful comment, and if it'd be all right. if
No
we could pass
problem.
her.
Claire, I didn't see you motioning over there.
Thank you, Dr. Oliver, and thank you, Madam Superintendent. I just wanted to clarify to the superintendent's point that actually state law does not allow the State Board of Ed to dictate curriculum and resource guides at the state level. So the wording in this was done intentionally for a review versus approval, because under state law, that authority rests at the local level with districts. So I wanted to clarify, if you need to amend the resolution because it's not clear, I just want to make sure you know that there was some thought behind that wording, that it didn't say approve, it said review for a reason.
And that was pretty much my point. Troy?
I'd really like to strongly say the standards are very important, that the local groups get a chance to really work through the process. And we hire great educators in our buildings. And as a principal of a high school, I'm proud of my teachers and the work ethic that they have. They need this guidance to move forward, to create those references or recommendations themselves. And I'm sure that we're going to produce the best practices and share amongst the local schools on a regular basis to make it work. And I want to make sure that that stays in place. And that's what I've heard from a lot of the colleagues, that they did not want the federal government or the state to be involved in those kind of decisions in the classroom. And I think that we're doing our job of taking the information, and we're ready to do the work that's going to be needed to make it best for the kids of Indiana.
And so I would also make a comment that I would not be in favor of adding the word approval. I don't want to take away any local autonomy at all with what we put out. In addition, I would be more than happy to bring that review to you at such a time that's going to allow you to give input on it before we send it out. My group is ready to work diligently on that, and I think we'll be bringing it to you in advance of June 15th, so that we can, make sure that you can have input into whatever the draft is that we're working with. Andrea?
I'm not sure I see how requiring board approval takes away local autonomy. Is your concern that because of the speed, coming up with a high-quality resource guide by the middle of June is a tall order, that we would just be sort of that last check on the process to make sure what gets sent out is actually of exceptional quality?
Let me go ahead and also talk about that resource information continues. We are not going to be producing a document that's the end-all be-all by June 15th. It will continue to evolve as we teach these standards for 6 years. It is a process that's always happening. We take a great deal of input from the field, from educators as they're starting to implement the standards, and they are continually evolving. We always add more resources to what teachers may want to refer to. So they're meant as guidance for teachers and educators and schools to use to help them with the implementation of the standards. So we will have our initial work ready to go by July 1 to be distributed out to educators. But I just want to reiterate, that's really an ongoing kind of process and always has been an ongoing process. David?
The intent of the motion was not to take any local control, and as all of you know, I'm a key advocate for local control on many, many issues. I'm just concerned that review can be, here's the review, here's the packet, we get 2 minutes before the meeting, review it, and it's sent on, and then there's a number of people who are very uncomfortable with what we have endorsed by our review. So a review could mean a cursory carte blanche, let's send it off, or a review could mean a substantial discussion of what is that, what's in that particular resource packet. So that's what I'm advocating, a higher level of review that would require us to have a discussion, potentially have someone from DOE answer questions, and really get at the heart of what is being recommended to schools. Some school districts will accept that recommended list from DOE as the reading list. Others will take more time to review it. I just want to be sure that we have time ourselves as a board to actually look at it, discuss it. Not to take away any authority from local schools, but I think it's our obligation to carefully study it. And how does it hurt for us to take a vote on it? Who are we hurting? We're not hurting anyone. We're just doing our due diligence in being sure that's being what recommended is something we're comfortable with.
And David, I would say that we will have a robust review and discussion about it, as we do with all of our topics that we put on discussion. We have a motion before us. We have a second. We've had discussion.
Is this the motion on?
This is the amendment, yes. The amendment to add the words "and approval." Review and approval. Roll call, please.
Mr. Albert?
Yes.
Mr. Elsner?
Yes.
Dr. Freitas?
Yes.
Mr. Hendry?
Yes.
Ms. Neal?
Yes.
Mrs. O'Brien?
Yes.
Dr. Oliver?
Yes.
Mr. Walker?
Yes.
Mr. Watts?
Yes.
Mrs. Wicker?
Yes.
Superintendent Ritz?
Yes.
There you go.
The motion before us now is with the amendment. Those in, let's have any more discussion on the amendment.
Call a question.
Okay, roll call, please.
Mr. Albert?
Yes.
Mr. Elsner?
Yes.
Dr. Freitas?
Yes.
Mr. Hendry?
Yes.
Ms. Neal?
No.
Mrs. O'Brien?
Yes.
Dr. Oliver?
Yes.
Mr. Walker?
Yes.
Mr. Watts?
Yes.
Mrs. Wicker?
Yes.
Superintendent Ritz?
Yes. Motion approved. There are no more business to come before this board for today. May I have a motion to adjourn?
Adjournment.
Second?
Second.
Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? This meeting is adjourned. Those who are serving on the assessment subcommittee, you want to have kind of an hour break?
Or even just, I don't care how long, but I need a little break.
Yeah, let's have an hour break. Let's meet at 1.